Okay, I needed to wait for my cue. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'll actually do just a quick introduction, and Deanna will continue on with diving in a little bit more into the purpose of the guide and its origins before we get into the structure. My name is Heather Torres. I am a citizen of San Alfonso Pueblo and a descendant of the Navajo Nation. I'm also Mexican, and I work for the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, a national training and technical assistance provider for tribes across the country in various areas of the creation and maintenance of systems of justice and care. And I get to work with our wonderful team, including Marlon Footracer and Miss Kelly Stoner, which I'm sure many of the audience is familiar with. She sends her regards. She was supposed to join us today, but was unable to. But we look forward to the presentation today, to your questions and feedback, and just your support of this handbook and its message. So I'll turn it over to Deanna to talk a little bit deeper about the purpose and the origins, and then we'll dig into the guide.
So just really talking about the purpose of the guide, one of the things that we really wanted to do was to give people, we didn't want to do a cookie cutter. We didn't want to just give you an MOU and say, this is what you should do, because everyone, we realize, is different. All of our communities are different. Our needs are different. So in thinking about the purpose of this guide, we wanted to really give a really clear, detailed kind of outline of items that we felt like needed to be included, and give you some optional things that you could pull from to do an MOU on your own. And this is beautifully written, and TLPI did a wonderful job of really giving a lot of concrete examples. There's also in the back of this a kind of a checklist of, did you include this? Did you include this? And so the purpose of this guide is really to think about your partnerships, and to use that when you're drafting and from our purposes, a tribal criminal child maltreatment MDT MOU document. I feel like this has great, this could be used in so many different areas. So for our purposes, it is kind of what our origin was of what we wanted to do, but we feel like this can be utilized in the field in many, many different ways. So tribal MDTs, working with non-tribal partners, and really looking at that to improve that relationship and have a clear understanding of how they're going to work together for our Native children and families. So we really, that was kind of the purpose of the guide, is we really wanted to have a clear guide for our Native nations as they work with non-tribal partners, and also some explanation for our non-tribal partners of why these things are so important for our communities to put into this memorandum of understanding. So that was kind of just the our overall purpose of what we really anticipated the guide to be. I will tell you, in our initial thinking, we thought it would be, 3 or 4 pages, and as you can see, it's so much more comprehensive in that, and so much there's so much more depth to this product than what we even anticipated. And that's why I'm so excited to just see it in the field and all of the different uses that ways people are going to be able to utilize this handbook. Can you go to the next slide? So I think I talked about this earlier. I tend to do that a lot. I apologize. I tend to start talking, and I do all my slides in one big spiel. But we identified that need in the field. We also just a couple of things. We have some practice briefs where we really thought about MOUs and authentic partnerships as we were getting ready to think about the development of this handbook. And really, we wanted to stress the importance of having this MOU with our Native nations and non-tribal partners. We do have some links to the handbook that are in the chat in case anybody wants to wants to click onto that, we have a link from our website, and there's also a TLPI link as well if anybody doesn't have a copy of that but wants to click onto that and have it as Heather works through that. It'll be just for your own, as Heather works that just for your own use. So I think you want to, yeah. So I'm going to turn it over to Heather. She's going to talk about the structure and the utilization of the guide, and I might chime in if there's some specific things for the CAC MDT field to consider, but I'm going to turn it over to the experts in the field now.
The experts, that's you, Deanna. But thank you so much. It was a real honor for Kelly and I to be able to work on this publication together with Deanna and some of you possibly who kind of provided insight as folks who are currently running child advocacy centers. We showed some folks at some initial drafts and were able to really refine some information that I think was going to create a lot of strong impact in the field. And so here is the overall structure of the guide on this slide here. We decided to break it up into two parts. One part really focusing on clauses that we think are really important when a tribal CAC is creating an MOU or when a tribal partner is at the table at a non-tribal MDT or in partnership with a non-tribal child advocacy center. And within each part, there is substantive text that explains about the particular clauses that we pulled out to discuss. There are 2 examples of the clauses being discussed and 2 questions that we call points to ponder. They're exactly meant to do as they are titled. They're meant for you all to kind of reflect during the drafting process or during the negotiation process of an MOU, really thinking about some considerations that might have deeper impact for tribal partners. And so that structure is followed throughout the guide and continued in part 2, which is a section we called other clauses, just more generic or general clauses that you would see in an MOU, but we added some specific special considerations that might be involved in working with tribes. And so again, it follows that same structure of substantive text explaining why a particular clause was chosen and is important to highlight in the handbook, 2 examples of the clause being discussed, and 2 points to ponder questions. And so later in the presentation, we'll actually do a deeper dive into a couple clauses in both part 1 and part 2, so you can see the flow of the resource and how you can really use it as someone who's maybe assigned to draft this MOU for their MDT or is just new to the MOU process. We're trying to be intentional about this guide being something that you can just pick up and go from whatever state that you may be in at the time. We also realized, as Deanna said, we didn't want a cookie cutter. We didn't want a model, right? Because everybody's circumstances and context for their work of their MDTs is going to be different. People's relationships with each other may be different. When working with MDTs, we have to acknowledge all the different lenses that come together to pull together the MDT, and which is why an MOU is so important to help document the commitments and the alignment of the MDT members. I will say that this is, not an exhaustive list of, everything that might have to be in your MOU, but we did try and pull out some general enough clauses where we could dig in and provide particular insights on what might be applicable for tribal partners involved with an MDT. The last piece of the guide you'll notice is in the appendix is an MOU drafting checklist. I know Kelly will back me up on this. Lawyers love checklists and things that you can just go off and say, okay, yes, I talked about that, I addressed that. And so at the end of the handbook, there is a drafting checklist that pulled out all the different clauses that were discussed in part 1 and part 2. So if you needed to show up at a meeting or you have a MOU to print out and you want to review it, you can print out that checklist and it can kind of be a guide for you. So we're really excited to show you more about the guide today. And so I think our first part we're going to discuss is part 1. So if you can advance the slide, Marlon. So part 1, these are some areas or clauses that we picked out that we thought would be particularly important for a tribally specific MOU. Again, this is not exhaustive. It's kind of starting from the ground up considerations, but sometimes those partners need some of that basic education and awareness that Deanna was mentioning earlier, right? So we have here listed tribal sovereignty, sovereign immunity, confidentiality and information sharing, mandatory reporting of child abuse and neglect, and culturally appropriate services. So in thinking about tribal sovereignty and addressing that in an MOU, it's super important that the groups and folks that are coming together on the MDT understand what it means to be working with a sovereign nation, right? It's not just a cultural program or a cultural organization that's being brought to the table. It's a sovereign nation with investment in the well-being of its families and its children. And so it's super important. There's different ways that you can incorporate tribal sovereignty into an MOU, but we talked about it and expressed it as a separate clause that folks might want to consider. And even if a state is working, it's a state child advocacy center that's looking at the guide, we hope that it can convey, this handbook can convey that importance of acknowledging and honoring tribal sovereignty throughout the formation, development, and implementation of the MDT. Sovereign immunity, again, is particularly important because folks will be working with a sovereign nation if they bring a tribe onto the team, or if it's the tribal CAC that's initiating the MOU. There's a lot of well-meaning, well-intentioned folks who are working with tribes, but sometimes unintentionally compromise a tribe's sovereign immunity through some of the language in the agreements, and that we do not want that to open up the door for the tribe to have any liabilities or to be sued in any capacity. And so we provided some examples of sovereign immunity clauses and also discussed the importance around what sovereign immunity is and why it's important to be addressed in an MOU. We tried to write for the non-lawyer. As Deanna mentioned, I think her team was thinking maybe 4 or 5 pages, and then us lawyers got a hold of it, and we had like a 60-page document, but which we then whittled down to the really most important information. But we also do this in TLPI organizationally, really tries to create our resources that are meant for the non-lawyer and are just meant for folks who are actually doing the work and are really giving those practical tips. So we hope that you see that as you read the guide or read the handbook and the importance of the various clauses that we decided to pull out. Confidentiality and information sharing. As my folks have taught me at TLPI, particularly Ms. Bonnie Claremont, our victim advocacy specialist, and Ms. Kelly Stoner, victim information and that protection of victim information is the cornerstone of victim safety. So we wanted to make sure that we discussed clauses around confidentiality and information sharing. And so we know that this sometimes can be a tension point for MDT teams. And so we wanted to make sure that we discussed it and talked about how different members of the MDT will have different responsibilities and duties to the protection of confidentiality. They may be restricted by their office policies and procedures, their grant requirements, et cetera. And so we wanted to make sure that we addressed all of those, the fact that that's what happens when MDTs come together, while honoring the importance of information sharing within that MDT setting and providing as much protection to that information as possible. Mandatory reporting, obviously a must for any MDT consideration. And we thought it was particularly important to share with folks that there might be additional duties, whether that's, tribal mandated reporting, state mandated reporting, and also federal mandated reporting, depending on the circumstances of the case. You all want to be aware of those types of responsibilities. And so we included a discussion and examples of clauses regarding mandatory reporting. And then lastly, we wanted to address culturally appropriate services. Again, this is part of kind of honoring tribal sovereignty while also honoring tribal values and approaches to building healthy families. And so we discuss in that particular section some sample clauses that might be helpful to ensure that the importance of creating an environment and an MDT response that is inclusive of culturally appropriate and culturally grounded services is so important. So that's a broad overview of the MOU clauses that we felt were particularly important to include for tribal specificity. Again, this is not all inclusive, but we reviewed tons and tons of different MOUs in the creation of this guide, and we felt these were some areas that were very important and were strongly encouraged when we looked at agreements between, particularly between non-tribal and tribal entities. So we hope you agree. And if you have any feedback for us on how we could expand in the future, we'd welcome that. Next slide, please. So other MOU clauses, this would be part 2 in the handbook. So these are clauses that you would find in a pretty standard MOU with anyone involved in any situation. But we thought that there might, these clauses in particular might have particular tribal considerations for folks to think about. A statement of purpose, an annual review, severability, beginning and end date clause, and the signatory clause. Purpose, well, actually, I believe we picked that one to dive a little deeper in today, so I won't say too much there, but as I mentioned, the MDT team brings a lot of different personalities, perspectives, professionals together, and sometimes the purpose can get lost in the sauce or lost in the implementation, or things arise in a particular case, and so folks sometimes get caught up in the way that they would like to respond. And so sometimes having a statement of purpose being very clear in the MOU can help be a landing point or a touch point for when the MDT loses momentum or when there's a difference in approach. Annual review, most healthy MDTs have a regular review process. It helps ensure, quality control, and it continues, and it helps to have a continuous focus on what's best for the children. And we all realize that in these various fields that make up an MDT and working with tribes, that sometimes there are things like staff turnover, or you lose a particular stakeholder or a particularly strong staff member who was a part of the MDT and a strong advocate. So in the annual review process, we talk about how regular updates to tribal stakeholders or government bodies can be a strategy to help keep the community aware of the MDT's work and the tribe invested and all partners invested in the continued function of the MDT. Severability, that clause just protects your MDT MOU. So it basically says if any clause is found to be unlawful, the rest of the MOU still stands, which is super important to the maintenance of your MDT. The time period, just to be aware of the durations of your obligations and commitments. And again, it's kind of tied to your signatories, and a little bit of, the annual review conversation is, do you have the proper folks at the table who are signing the agreement, who are invested in the MDT, and are aware of what the commitments and obligations are and responsibilities are of the various agencies that are coming together for the MDT, and what happens when people change, et cetera. So these are the clauses that we picked out to discuss in part 2, and we'll be diving into the statement of purpose section a little bit later in today's webinar. Next slide. So example clauses will appear after every initial discussion of a clause type. So where you saw sovereign immunity, there would be a discussion of what sovereign immunity is, why it's important, a discussion of applicable NCA standards that move toward accreditation of your CAC. And then there will be examples, textual examples of clauses. These examples are a place to start. They're a place to customize and really contextualize to your situation and your members of your MDT and your environment. It really those examples should be tailored to your purpose and your circumstances. In providing these sample clauses, Kelly and I searched, and some of our interns at TLPI searched far and wide for lots and lots of different MOUs, particularly in the child advocacy context, but also outside the child advocacy center context, and try to really look at non-tribal and tribal partnerships, as well as tribally led partnerships, to guide us in providing these examples. So we screened all of these and really looked at all the different ways folks were able to articulate different clauses in their MOUs and tried to provide examples that were going to be a fruitful exercise for anyone in the drafting process for their MDT. Okay, and 2 example clauses are provided for each clause type. We can go to the next slide to show an example. So what's pictured here on the screen is what it visually looks like, a screen capture of the handbook. Example clause number 1 for tribal sovereign immunity. Here, this one is a pretty clear and clear-cut example. It's 1 sentence, and it says, nothing whatsoever in this MOU constitutes or shall be construed as a waiver of the tribe's sovereign immunity. So not all of the examples will be this short, but this sentence works really well. It's very straightforward, it's declarative, and it gets at the language of the MOU, but also any possible interpretation. So this is one example that was shared after the discussion of the importance of including a tribal sovereign immunity or addressing tribal sovereign immunity in your MOU. Next slide. The second example here, oh, it looks like it got zoomed in a little bit, but this is example number 2 from the Tribal Sovereign Immunity Clause section. You can notice that this one is a little bit more fleshed out than example number 1, where it was just that short declarative sentence. But this approach adds a little bit to that short sentence. It talks about this MOU shall not be deemed, construed, or implied to be a waiver of sovereign immunity of either party. And it even covers if for some reason a clause did constitute a waiver of sovereign immunity, it says that waiver shall be strictly and narrowly construed. And it also discusses the intended what the MOU does, and it's meant to facilitate the coordination of services, not intended to impose legal obligations or liabilities. So this is just another approach to incorporating a clause that protects tribal sovereign immunity in a MDT MOU. Go to the next one. Oh, beautiful. I'm zooming to you from Southern California, and we just are getting some rain. So apologies if you're hearing the raindrops on my window next to my desk. But this next slide is addressing the points to ponder. So we have the clause type. We discussed the clause type and why it's important and its connection to the NCAA standards towards accreditation. We provide 2 examples of what that clause could look like. And then we provide points to ponder. So the points to ponder are basically 2 discussion questions tied directly to the tribal issue to consider when drafting or navigating negotiations relative to an MDT MOU. The points to ponder are to help facilitate you to really make the language of the clauses responsive to your particular situation, and to kind of deepen your thought about what you might want to include in the MOU and in the language. Again, there's 2 questions. Sometimes the questions are good prompts, not only for the clause type that it's tied to, but also for other clauses in your MOU. But they're thought questions to really kind of get you to think more deeply about other places that you may want to concretize considerations for tribes. So on the screen here, we gave you another screen grab picture of what it's going to look like in the handbook, the points to ponder section. This is actually from the tribal sovereignty clause section, and it lists the 2 questions. Question 1 is, does the MOU recognize and respect tribal sovereignty, including a tribe's right to protect Native children and insist on ICWA compliance? Question 2 is, does the proposed agreement include requirements to keep the tribal government informed on the successes or challenges of the MDT through reports or otherwise? So again, these are thought reflection questions to see if these could help you craft stronger language for your clauses. in your MDT MOU. We tossed ICWA in there because we noticed that ICWA compliance generally worked well in some of the MOUs that we reviewed. Sometimes we kind of noticed that there might have been particular circumstances or challenges with the particular parties in an agreement, and it specified things where there was a specific note about ICWA notice shall be complied with, tribal kinship or fostering licensure or processes will be respected. So we wanted to make sure and throw in ICWA compliance in there, because for some MDT teams, it might be a no-brainer. Everybody kind of understands what ICWA compliance is, but maybe for your community and your MDT, there might be some struggles with particular pieces of ICWA compliance that you might want to consider addressing in the MOU. These other thought questions, we're just trying to think about how reporting out to tribal stakeholders around the successes or challenges can really lend credibility to the partnership, that everybody is kind of in it together and keeps the community invested and the team connected in the work of the MDT. In the chat box, if you want to give us feedback on these points to ponder questions, we'd love to hear it. But this is just one example, and these are provided in for each clause type that is discussed in the handbook. Throughout the handbook, you'll also see these notes, which will be in these call-out boxes between these two dark blue navy lines, where there are just larger considerations that may be cut across multiple clause types. And so the example that we showed here of a screen grab of what it looks like in our handbook is a note on tribal data sovereignty. So it notes, if your MOU addresses the sharing of tribal data, it is prudent to seek the approval of the tribal governing body or a designee. Tribes have long been concerned regarding the ownership of tribal data collection and dissemination. Tribal data can affect tribal funding, tribal privacy, and intellectual property rights, among other critical interests. In short, the tribe should have ownership over data, as well as the power to determine how that tribal data will be used. And so again, there's other notes on other topics throughout the handbook that we just wanted to make sure folks had awareness of as they were working through their drafts. Okay, if there's any questions so far, please let us know in the chat or in the Q&A function. We're now going to do a deeper dive into one of our tribal clauses from part 1. Okay, so our deeper dive topic for today, our clause type, is confidentiality and information sharing clause. So on the slide here, you'll see a discussion of what is touched upon in the description or the discussion in the handbook around why confidentiality and information sharing clauses are important. Each section will include a connection to the NCAA standards that work towards accreditation for child advocacy centers. Again, we all understand that maintaining confidentiality and the need to information share within the team is an essential function. And it's really important for the health of the MDT, but also for the response to the family and child in need. You'll see that in the discussion of this clause, we discussed the NCAA standards, we discussed confidentiality, as well as specific MDT laws that might be applicable. So we provided some examples from the state of Washington and the state of California that discuss the protection of information and confidentiality within MDT teams within the state. We would also encourage you to think about whether your tribe or the tribe in question in the partnership has its own laws around tribal MDTs. And so we wanted to make sure that we let folks know that there are these state laws that also could be at play in protecting your particular MDT. We also discussed the connection between the duty of confidentiality and privilege. And I know Kelly would be remiss if I didn't mention that if you all can encourage the protection of your MDT's information through a statute that provides a privilege, that just ups the ante in terms of your protections around information shared in MDTs. This could be a tribal privilege, a state privilege. But that connection between the duty of confidentiality and the privilege to level up the protection of the information that's shared within the MDT is going to be super important to think about as you're drafting your MDT MOU. And then the last topic that's discussed is just balancing the responsibilities of the different professionals that are at the table, right? Different folks are going to have different ethical obligations depending on their profession. But we also have to strike that balance of meeting the purpose of the MDT and ensuring the health and safety of children and families. And so we talk a little bit about that and how if folks can share upfront what those responsibilities are in regards to confidentiality and information sharing, the better off the MDT will be. Deanna, anything to add on this piece? Okay.
Nope, I think that's good.
Okay, so after that discussion in the handbook on confidentiality, what it is, why it's important, you'll see the examples. So example number 1 from confidentiality is put up on the screen. This is a longer example that talks a little bit more about confidentiality and how it's going to apply to this MDT. It's a 3-paragraph example. The first paragraph talks about how the sharing of sensitive or protected information between the state and tribal agencies and their representatives is tied to the purpose of the MDT, which is preventing, treating, investigating, and prosecuting child physical and sexual abuse. The second paragraph talks more about what MDT members may disclose in terms of confidential information to their MDT team. And it talks about the duties with respect to mandatory reporting, noting that there may be tribal, state, and federal laws with respect to mandatory reporting that must be followed. And it also mentions the importance of cross-reporting all instances of child abuse or neglect involving said tribe and the non-tribal MDT members. And the third paragraph addresses confidential information that may not be disclosed to the public or non-MDT members. And it includes a practice of where each MDT member will be required to sign a confidentiality form or statement to be part of the MDT and will be part of the MDT's record. So this is example 1 of the confidentiality and information clause where you can take a look at this handbook. You can copy and paste if you want, but from copy and paste, please think about the points to ponder. Please think about your particular circumstances with the members of your MDT and think about how this could be really tailored to meet the needs of your partnership. Example number 2 from the confidentiality section is a 2-paragraph example. The first paragraph, again, addresses the importance of adhering to relevant laws and practices around protecting pertinent case information. It talks about enabling the MDT to respond to the immediate and ongoing needs of the child, caregiver, and family. Importantly, it mentions the importance of trying to make every effort to get informed consent from the legal guardian of the child client, because we know children aren't able to consent on behalf of themselves. And it talks about being clear about the scope and time frame of which the informed consent is going to be allowed. And it also, again, brings in that duty of mandatory reporting. Again, be sure to think about state mandatory reporting, federal mandated reporting, and any tribal mandated reporting laws. The second paragraph is actually just 1 sentence, and it talks about how, in this example, it talks about how a team non-disclosure agreement will actually be signed at each case review meeting. So this takes a little bit of a different approach than example 1 that kind of seemed to use a blanket confidentiality or non-disclosure agreement. This example and example 2 requires that a non-disclosure agreement be signed at every meeting. Points to ponder for confidentiality and information sharing. There are 2 questions up on the screen. Question 1, does your tribe have a statute that extends a privilege to protect the MDT records and information? Gosh, you didn't have lawyers help write this at all. If not, is a statute needed to protect the MDT information? you know, that extra layer of privilege, because even though the MDT team is tight and there could be state laws and things protecting the sharing of information amongst the members of the MDT team, a privilege kind of helps protect others who might want to request or subpoena that information from the MDT team. So that's where we were kind of thinking and prompting you all to think about how a privilege might further protect MDT records. Question number 2, are there any tribal agency MDT members that have federal funding requirements regarding disclosing client information and/or requirements relative to an informed consent release of information? If so, what are those requirements? So again, the whole thought is to be open and honest about what folks' requirements or duties are going to be based on their individual policies and procedures, to be aware that some folks might not be able to share based on things like funding requirements, certain information, and to lay all that out front so that the whole MDT understands the parameters around what each individual is operating under in participating in the MDT. I think this is also important to think about in terms of communicating with the families as well, right? Wouldn't you say, Deanna, talking about what the duty of mandated reporting, et cetera. So in addition to the MDT team being very solid about everybody's duties and responsibilities, also communicating those to families that are the MDT team is working with is also really important.
I think it's with our families, it's incredibly important because we want to make sure that they know that we're not just giving this information out to anyone that walks through our door, but we do have a process that's in place, that's very laid out and very clear to all of our partners what we're going to share and how we're going to share that information.
Thank you. Okay, so that was our deeper dive into the confidentiality and information sharing question or section of the handbook. If you have any questions, thoughts, feedback, please pop them into the chat. And with that, we will actually do another deeper dive into part 2, other MOU clauses. And I believe we're going to be looking at the statement of purpose clause. Okay, so in the statement of purpose clause, these bullets outline the discussion of the clause and its importance that opens up the section. The purpose statements encapsulate the shared drive behind forging partnerships. They clearly outline why the parties are coming together, and they can be used to refocus partners when momentum has shifted from original intent statements. So sometimes folks, get into it or something happens and there's different ideas around the approach to solve a particular challenge. So sometimes when that happens, it's good to say, hey, let's go back to our values, our purpose that is articulated in our MOU. Which pathway or which approach is going to get us as close as possible to executing and implementing our purpose. That's all super helpful when thinking about drafting a purpose of statement clause and what you might want to be including. It could be an opportunity to articulate partnership core values. If you want one of the MDT's core values to be to affirm and honor tribal sovereignty, that might be worth putting in your statement of purpose clause as a core value from your MDT. You might want to put culturally relevant and culturally appropriate services and the impact of having Indigenous knowledge and practices be part of the services that are available to the families that are being served. And so those are some things that you could think about when thinking about a statement of purpose clause. And then lastly, I think another point to mention is that maybe there's a way to address or highlight any specific issues being addressed by the partnership. Say, for example, there's kind of been a historical struggle with ICWA compliance. Maybe you want to put some sort of affirmation of and belief in ICWA and what it stands for in your statement of purpose or a values or mission statement for your MDT. So this is the opening discussion points regarding the statement of purpose clause within the handbook. All right, example number 1, screen grab from the handbook. Example clause number 1 for statement of purpose. This one has a 3-part statement of purpose. It notes that the parties enter into this agreement to A, increase the quality and efficiency of state and tribal benefits and services to child victims. B, create and implement an MDT with a shared referral, intake, and interviewing procedures, collaborative decision-making, and coordinated and culturally responsive case planning and service delivery. And C, foster and strengthen the cooperation between and advise and assist the many agencies involved in child physical and sexual abuse cases. So bullet B actually is taken, I think it's pretty much taken from in the language within the NCAA standards, so that those resources from the NCAA could also be some inspiration for you all for the language that's put into the MOU. But this one is pretty straightforward, and it mostly focuses on the three-pronged purpose for the MDT. Example number 2, for statement of purpose. This one actually incorporates a mission statement. And so we have a screen grab of example 2 from the handbook, and it's a 2-paragraph example. Paragraph 1 says the mission of titled CAC or MDT team is to improve the effectiveness of the investigation and prosecution of child abuse crimes, decreasing the trauma for victims and their families in particular area, to provide regional and national leadership on child abuse issues. It affirms that the undersigned parties agree to support this stated mission. And the second paragraph acknowledges that through the designated representatives, they are going to agree to follow and annually review the MOU and create and maintain policies, procedures, and protocols for any other implementation materials in accordance with the mission and the MOU. I think I noticed in the chat some talks around, the processes around, how to handle when confidentiality is broken, or that policies and procedures piece with regard to the MOU, right? So this was actually something that Kelly, Deanna, and we touched base on as we were creating this handbook. We were very tempted, and I think at one point we had a full-on section that discussed policy and procedure development and its connection to MOU creation. And so I think in the handbook, you'll see some discussion about the different ways that you can incorporate policies and procedures. You can either treat them as their standalone policies and procedures that you develop once an MOU is executed and you have your stated values and commitments, or you can incorporate policies and different policies and procedures, or maybe specific policies and procedures like a confidentiality P&P into the MOU. So I think there are a lot of different approaches, and it's very thinking about what happens when there is a confidentiality breach is super important to maintaining the work of the MDT, the safety of children and families. So thank you so much for bringing that up.
Yeah, I did answer her, Heather. I just also want to say that within teams, when we organize, we typically we do sign-in sheets at our case review meetings. And within that sign-in sheet, we typically have whether it's tribal state law, a team out of our policy and procedures will have a statement in there that says, this is a confidential meeting. No, this information is not to be used in any manner other than what it's intended according to tribal state law. And all team members will sign that. And I am a big proponent of it being signed at every meeting, because I feel like that as team members, we need to constantly be acknowledging how we're going to use this confidential information for this family and for this case that we're working on, and making sure that we always keep that in the forefront of our thoughts. And if a team member says, oh, I didn't know, you can say, we sign it at every meeting. You need to make sure that this is very clearly laid out how we're going to use this information, and if you don't use it in the correct way, what are the consequences of that?
Super important. Folks might think every meeting, but it's important to remind folks of that duty and that responsibility. Looks like other folks follow that as well. Okay, so these are the pictured on the screen is a screen grab of the points to ponder section for the statement of purpose clause type within the handbook. There are two questions. Question one, what are some of the underlying issues that led you to consider entering into a MOU? And question two, do all parties have the same understanding of the approach to be taken to accomplish those goals? Again, these questions are to help you think about different things as you're drafting a purpose statement or statement of purpose clause, and could really inform other clauses as well if you are experiencing certain issues within your team or within your geographic area that you want to make sure make it into the MOU in a statement of purpose or another clause. And, you know, I think the question that when we were thinking about these things and drafting the points to ponder questions, we tried to think a little bit kind of broadly about what could the variety of different MDT teams that are out there, the variety of relationships and levels of partnership and collaboration that are out there. And so, again, the points to ponder are really meant for you to think and reflect about your particular set of circumstances and relationships and how the language of the MOU can help propel what you're looking for out of the partnership and the operation of the MDT. All right, and I think that wraps up our deeper dives and our general overview of our handbook. We have resources and technical assistance up for you on the screen, both at the Native Child Advocacy Resource Center, TLPI, and the National Children's Alliance standards, which were incorporated throughout the handbook. And I think I did good on time. So I think we have if we have room for questions, thoughts, we're happy to engage in that before we let you go for today.
Hi, Heather. We have a question. Is state law cited in the MOU? It looks.
Okay, so I kind of received that question two ways. So the first way is state law cited in the handbook, which we reviewed today. Yes, we did provide two examples of state law as it refers to confidentiality and information sharing. We just thought the state of Washington and the state of California laws around that were important to share in that particular clause type section. If you're developing an MOU itself, it really depends on who's really leading the MDT and part of the team. And then you as a team will think about, or if you're the lead informing, or if you're collaborating with others, you'll think about where it might be useful to cite to state law. Is that fair, Deanna?
Yes, absolutely. And also tribal code as well might be cited in there. It just really depends on when you're looking at that with your partner, what that's going to look like and what you are going to feel is necessary to include in there.
Mm-hmm.
There's one more question. And it looks like Miko, I have a question. What would be your stance on the jurisdiction side of the tribal cases involving state receiving tribes? Is that the right? State recommendation for tribes and
Maybe state recognized tribes.
Recognized
Deanna,
tribes,
if you want to.
That's what it is. Recognized. Thank you.
I'm going to look at what was your stance on the jurisdictional side of tribal cases involving state recognized tribes? Oh, I think that gets into that's a really loaded question, I think, because I think it's going to depend on how those states identify, if they're not federally recognized, how those states, what the state, how that state recognition is written. So I think it's probably going to be a state by state basis. And so you're going to have to do some exploration with that state recognized tribes on what their jurisdictional boundaries may look like within the state, because it's going to vary from state to state. Is that correct, Heather? Just from a legal standpoint?
You know, I think that's definitely something to look into, and particularly looking at the state's designation. And you'll have to look at your team and what your team's trying to accomplish and what you can have on, you know, that could propel you forward. And so I think taking it on a case-by-case basis and looking at that recognition would be extremely important.
Great. And then I want to drop, Marlon had shared the evaluation, and I just want to share that again. And there's one more question. Do you have a report of, oops, got moved, of the best practices that gives an overview of success? So, and this is also from Miko. Yeah.
Miko, is that success for the team, or success for MOU, or? I think we can unmute you too if you want to.
She said it looks like MOUs and the team to support.
Yeah, I think we have some great examples of MOUs. Sue Parker just talked about their team is out of Montana. They have a wonderful team that does that has some really great MOUs with partners that they utilize. I have if you want to email me directly, I'll put my email in the chat, and I'd be glad to talk. Yeah, there's my email right there. I'd be glad to talk through these issues with you just offline, because I think I'm really interested in the resources that maybe we could help you with guidance for state recognized tribes. So if you want to just email me directly, I'll be glad to talk with you offline through all those questions.
Great. And that looks like the question. Anybody else with questions?
Real quick, as we wait for that, I realized that we didn't really discuss the resources section of our handbook. And I just wanted to point that out, that that's there right before the checklist. And it has links to the Child Information Gateway that talks about mandatory reporting laws. It has links to the National Children's Alliance, to the Native Child Advocacy Resource Center, but also cases around sovereign immunity if you need to do some education around the topic as you're working through your MOU, and also statutes regarding the reporting of child abuse, as well as the state statutes that were cited in the confidentiality section. So please check that out, and let us know how you're using the handbook. We'd love to hear about how you're using it, if you found it useful. Reach out to us at any time. And we look forward to just seeing the impact that this could have. And we appreciate you all for joining us today and all of the work that you do.